This morbid incident happened 8 years ago. I had been saving up money for a new house, and at the end of July, I had managed to get enough money to buy one. I probably looked through over 20+ houses during my search, and after looking through those 20, I finally found the one that was perfect for me. It was an old blue house that was located at the end of the street. It had plenty of rooms as it was a family house, and it also had a beautiful interior. But as amazing as it was, the best thing about the house was its price. The deal I had gotten on it seemed too good to be true, as I wondered why a house this big and this nice was on sale for such a low price. I remember the realtor who was trying to sell me the house told me that she had been trying to sell the house for a while now, but for some reason, most of the potential buyers always seemed to drop out or change their minds before the deal was made. I remember being completely baffled as I wondered why anyone in their right mind would turn down a deal like this. As I said earlier, the deal I was getting on this house seemed too good to be true, and I could tell the realtor really wanted to get it off her hands. I knew there had to be some sort of catch or a hidden reason as to why people didn't want this house, but I also knew that I wouldn't get a deal like this in the next million years, so I ignored my worried thoughts and bought it. I moved in the following week after everything concerning the paperwork had been settled. I had a lot of space since it was a family house and I lived alone, and while I didn't plan on finding a nice girl and starting a family yet, I looked at my new house as a future investment, as I told myself that I'd use it in case I ever wanted to do that in the future. The first few weeks were perfect as I was still in my honeymoon phase, but as time passed by, I started to notice some very strange things about my new house. For starters, I'd noticed the kids around the neighborhood avoided my house like it was the plague. I thought I was imagining it at first, but I soon realized that almost all the kids in the neighborhood were deathly afraid of my house. And it wasn't just the kids. Some adults, too, were also going out of their way to avoid my home. When I first noticed this, I thought there was a sewage leak or something. But after inspecting the front and back of the house, I saw nothing wrong. The strange behavior of my neighbors eventually began to worry me, and as more time passed by, things got even worse, as not only were they avoiding my house, most of them started to avoid me too. I was never told why I was being treated like this, as I asked myself if it was something I'd done, and even when I tried asking what the problem was, I was always brushed off. The joy I had originally gotten from buying the house had now turned into worry. I spent days racking my brain for answers to their strange behavior, and while I didn't find any at first, the 13th of November 2014 would bring a terrifying clue to the answers I was looking for. I had gotten back a bit late from work that day. I was too tired to cook anything, so I just had the usual microwave dinner and watched some TV. After that, I decided to have a quick shower, and after running the water and getting the shower ready, I laid down on my bed as I just wanted to shut my eyes for a little while before entering the shower. I guess I was pretty tired as I dozed off, and after 4+ hours, I was abruptly woken up by the sound of a talking child as I kept hearing the words, "Please call my father." I was perplexed at first as I wondered where the voice was coming from. Then I remembered I had been watching TV before I came to bed, so I told myself the voice had to be coming from the TV. I was still a bit confused as I could remember turning off the television, but it wasn't the first time I had left it on, so I made my way downstairs to turn it off. As I got closer to the living room, I was sure that it was the television now, as the sound was loudest there. But before I could reach the living room, I froze. Now, I was pretty sure that the voice was coming from the television, but standing close to the doorway of the living room, I finally realized it wasn't, because the room was completely dark, and I told myself that if the TV was on, I would have seen the light from it illuminating the room. I was completely frightened now, as even if the voice wasn't coming from the TV, it was definitely coming from the living room. I was so scared that I couldn't move, And I just stood there hearing this child's voice repeat the words, "Please call my father, please." I don't know how long I stood there. I'm guessing it was about 30 minutes or so, but just like it started out of nowhere, the voice abruptly stopped. I stood there for a while thinking I was going to hear it again, but I heard nothing but silence. After a couple of minutes, I decided to walk up to my bed, as I was too scared to look into the living room that night. The morning soon arrived, and I didn't sleep a wink. Eventually found the courage to check my living room, and when I did, I saw absolutely nothing. Everything was exactly the way I'd left it last night. The incident was mind-boggling as I wondered what it could have been. I decided not to tell anyone about it, as I didn't want to seem crazy. I did, however, have a hard time sleeping after that. A couple of weeks had passed now since the first strange incident. I had managed to start sleeping well again, as I told myself my mind was just playing tricks on me since I was home alone. But as the next day came, I started to doubt that theory. It was a Saturday afternoon. I was inside the living room reading a book, and I heard the words, "my child," coming from upstairs. Just like the last time, the voice kept repeating itself, but this time I could tell that it was a woman's voice. I quickly grabbed the signed baseball bat I had, as it was the only weapon I could find. I was really scared, just like the last time it happened, but I told myself that this time, I wasn't just going to stand there and do nothing, so I made my way to where the voice was coming from. I traced the voice back to one of the bedrooms, and when I got there, I lifted up the bat that quickly opened the door. Shockingly, the instant I opened the door, the voice stopped. As I stood in that room, a lot of things started to run through my head. I knew any other person in my shoes would have come up with strange theories like the house being haunted, but I wasn't a spiritual person, and I didn't believe in stuff like that. But at the same time, I was finding it very hard to come up with a feasible explanation for this. I thought about going to the cops and asking them to carry out an investigation, but I knew how ridiculous and insane I would look telling the cops that I was hearing voices in my house. The peculiar situation perplexed me, as, no matter how much I racked my brain, I didn't know what to do. I had basically spent my life savings on this house, so leaving wasn't an option. So I calmed myself and I hoped it would eventually stop. But just 3 days after the second incident, the third followed. I had started spending longer hours at work after the second incident, as I tried my best to lengthen the time I spent out of the house. I remember returning late from work that Wednesday. After arriving at my house, I tried to open the door when I heard a man say the words, "Please let us go from inside my house." Shocked, I backed away from the house, but no matter how far I got, I could still hear the voices. I felt everything that night, as I was terrified, frightened, and scared, but I was also annoyed now, as the third incident was the last straw for me. Knowing full well that insurance doesn't cover spirits or ghosts, I decided to try a drastic option, as I hired an acclaimed spiritual guru to get rid of the unwelcome house guests. The man arrived the next morning, and after pouring his powders and salts around my house, he started to say some incantations. I didn't really believe anything he was doing would work, and I was a bit salty that I had to pay $160 for this. But I was desperate, so I hoped that this mumbo-jumbo would be successful. The guru's incantations took some time, and while nothing really happened at first, I eventually started to hear gut-wrenching screams all over the house. I held my ears in pain as the screams pierced through my very soul. The guru, who had now noticed I was in pain, asked what was wrong, so I assumed he couldn't hear the screams I was hearing. I eventually couldn't take it anymore, so I tried tracing the sounds like last time, and I realized that they were coming from the basement. When I got there, it felt like the screams were coming from the floor, so I took a sledgehammer and started hitting the floor. The guru, who had followed me down, thought I had gone crazy, but I didn't care, as I wanted the screaming to stop, So I kept hitting the floor, and once I broke the concrete, the screaming stopped. The things I had seen under the broken concrete made me scream, and it wasn't long before the cops were called. 3 human skeletons were found in the floor of my basement. 2 of them belonged to adults, and the third one belonged to a child. I was called in for questioning, and I told them everything that had been happening in my home. And after I told them everything in detail, the cops then proceeded to answer all the questions that had been perplexing me for the past few months. I was told by the police officers that around 30 years ago, the entire Brewer family that had previously lived in my house had gone missing. Investigations revealed that the last man to be seen with the family was a man called Ryan Howard. The man was taken in for questioning, but unfortunately, he managed to kill himself before the police could get anything out of him. The case eventually slowed down after that, as Ryan Howard was the only person who could have told the police where to find the family. Detectives believed he had murdered the family, as Mr. Howard's track record showed that he had been in prison for attempted murder before. I was also told that the strange sentences I heard were exactly the same statements given by the questioned witnesses, as it was revealed that Harry, the child of Mr. and Mrs. Brewer, was heard saying the words, "Please call my father." Witnesses also stated that his mother, Sarah's known last words were, "Don't hurt my child," and the father, Morris Brewer's, were, "Please let us go." These were all the recorded statements that were got from the house during the murder. Due to this incident, the house had been stigmatized by the surrounding neighborhood and potential buyers who always lost interest whenever they found out about its past. The case had apparently gone cold a long time ago with no leads on the whereabouts of the family, and the cops said that, if not for my strange experiences, they might never have found the bodies. Even after 8 years, this incident is still fresh inside my head. It took a while before things got back to normal, and with a lot of therapy, I learned to move past it. The strange occurrences actually led me to see the world differently and in a more open-minded way, as I've come to realize that there are things in this world that science or logic can't explain. I've never heard any voices again since that day, and while the ghastly incident did leave me with some trauma, I'm very glad I was able to give the Brewer family the peace they so desperately needed. Most people enjoy being home alone. It's always good to spend time alone. I'm Molly, and I was never one who liked it, not after what happened to me when I was at the tender age of 9. I tried to find joy in it as I grew older, and I've gotten to a point where I am at ease during the day, but nights are always a hard pass. For a backstory, my mom passed away giving birth to my baby brother Jackson. This was back in the 90s, before we had cell phones. The power had gone out, and my mom went into labor. My dad tried to get her to the hospital, but something went wrong, and she pulled out on the way. They were able to save Jackson, but my mother was gone, leaving an empty hole in mine and my dad's hearts. Tragically, I lost both my parents that night. After my mom passed, my dad just checked out. Started missing a lot of school, and it felt as though I was taking care of Jackson more than my dad did. My grandma, his mother, would often come take care of me and my baby brother while he disappeared for hours at a time. When he came home, I could smell the alcohol on him, and sometimes hints of perfume mixed in with his cologne. Asked her where he goes, and she was always vague about the answers, as though she was protecting me from the truth. "Grandma, where does Daddy go when he leaves?" "He goes to your mother's grave to visit her. He misses her very much, you know. Why doesn't he take me with him? I miss her too." I was still trying to process death and the fact my mom was gone. At her funeral, my dad hardly looked at me, and he still hasn't held Jackson, despite the fact it's been 6 months. I know now that he resented Jackson, blamed him for my mother dying to bring him into the world. Your dad is grieving and wants you to understand what happened before he takes you to visit her. That answer never made sense to me, but she said it every single time. It wasn't like my father explained anything to me. One night, he went out, and he had been gone longer than usual. The phone rang around 4 a.m., and Grandma picked it up. I stood in the hallway, peering around the corner, listening to whatever I could catch. She hung up the phone and spotted me, put a smile on her face. "Your dad needs me to go pick him up. Jackson is sound asleep. You're 9 years old. Can you be a big girl for a few minutes and listen for him while I go get him?" "Why do you need to go get him?" "He has a car. He had a little too many big boy drinks, and I need to make sure he gets home safe." "But if it's a big boy drink, why does he need to ride home? He's a big boy." My grandma stifled a laugh and put her hand over her mouth as though it would stop the giggling. "He really is a big boy, but sometimes big people mess up too. Tonight, he really goofed up. I don't want to wake Jackson, so can you please be a big girl and watch over him?" I was uneasy at the thought, but agreed. Something about doing what a big girl does felt empowering, and my grandma trusted me to keep my baby brother safe while she was gone. She locked the door behind her as she left. I didn't want to sit alone in the dark, so I turned on a movie in the living room and kept it quiet. The bright colors of the cartoons I was watching was distracting my mind of the fact I was home alone late at night with my little brother down the hall. All seemed to be going well until I heard some humming coming from his room. I thought for a moment Grandma was back, but that hum sounded familiar. I tiptoed down the hallway. The humming got louder as I approached. I felt a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. Goosebumps formed on my skin as a horrible fear took over. Realized that hum sounded like my mother. I peeked into Jackson's room, and a woman in a nightgown covered in blood hovered over Jackson's crib, humming a tune my mom used to hum to me. My voice quivered as I called out for her, "Mommy." This woman turned to look at me. Her face was pale. Her eyes were sunken. A sinister smile crept across her lips as she glanced at me. "Molly, it's Mommy. I've missed you so much. Will you come to me?" I backed away in fear. Whatever this was not my mother. She looked like her, sounded like her, but my mom was always warm and comforting. This thing had me feeling terrified. She stepped closer to me, and I backed away more. "Take my hand, Molly. You could be with Mommy forever." I shook my head. I wasn't sure if what I did was out of fear or instinct, but I did not speak to her. Just kept backing away. Her tone grew colder. "Molly," said, "come with me." I turned to run and smacked into my grandma, who held up a rosary and said a prayer. The woman disappeared, but I began to cry in my grandma's arms. It turned out to be an evil spirit that was mimicking my mother. My grandma explained to me that she'd heard her around the house before. She said that since my mom died, my dad started dabbling in things he shouldn't have to contact her and welcomed a demon instead. The house was blessed, and we never saw her again. But that humming, if I'm alone at night, it still haunts me to this day. I don't know what was worse, losing my mother or something imitating her to mock my pain. My dad eventually straightened out, but the relationship with him was strained, and Jackson knows where he stands with him. It's heartbreaking, and Dad is trying. But I think whatever that I'm John, and I'm a cop. In my tenure of service, I've dealt with many cases of kidnapping, robbery, murder, and whatnot. But this home intrusion case had me shaken to my core. Elena was a working woman from a small rural town. She came to the city to get a good job. She eventually secured a job as a magazine editor at a big magazine company. Things had started to look good for her. A new job, a good apartment, and a nice city to live in. However, a few months into her smooth life in the city, things took a turn for the worst. One night, she was returning from her job around 8 in the evening. It was a busy period for the magazine, hence Elena was so late. When she stood in front of her apartment, she noticed that the front door was unlocked. She thought she might have left her door open by mistake and entered her home without thinking much about it. The next day, when she returned home from work, the door was open once more. However, this time Elena knew that she had locked the door properly. She had even checked it twice this time, so when the door was unlocked this time, she thought maybe the lock was broken. She immediately called a locksmith, and the locksmith confirmed that the lock was perfectly fine. Elena thought maybe it was her landlord, but quickly realized that her landlord was touring Europe for the last 3 weeks. It was almost bedtime, and Elena decided to sleep without bothering herself about the door. The next day, when she returned from work, the door was locked. She thought that for the last 2 days she was the one leaving the door open by mistake. It was the weekend, so Elena decided to relax and spend the 2 days in her apartment. She was cleaning it and reading books. On Monday, when she returned from her job, the front door was unlocked again. It was impossible to be a coincidence, so she went in and checked if anything was missing. But everything was where it was supposed to be. All her valuables were safe in her cupboard, and the rest of the items also seemed fine. Elena decided that if she found the door open one more time, she would install a CCTV camera in her home. The next day, when she came back from her work, the door was unlocked. She didn't even bother to go inside. She just locked the open door and drove straight to the mall to purchase a small home camera. That night, she sacrificed her sleep and set up the camera on a nearby table facing the front door. She wanted to get to the root of the matter. The camera was pretty basic. It just recorded the door all day long. She was not so sure about reporting this incident to the cops, as nothing in her house was missing. It wasn't a robbery. She thought that the cops would just suggest that she lock the door properly, or at most change the locks and install an alarm system. The next day, when Elena returned from work, the front door was open once more. Now, she was terrified. She slowly entered her home, where everything seemed normal. Nothing was missing as usual. She grabbed her laptop and slowly walked out of her home. She sat in a park behind her apartment building and started watching the footage. Till about 4 in the evening, there was no change in the footage. It just showed her front door, which remained firmly closed. Then, around 5 p.m., an hour before she returned, the door opened and entered a tall, lanky old man that stood in her living room for about 10 minutes, then walked out of the camera's sight towards the kitchen. Elena was terrified and called the cops. I was one of the first officers to reach the site. We made sure the area around her apartment building was safe. We found no traces of this man she claimed to have broken into her apartment. My senior officer told Elena that I would be stationed in front of her door at all times to ensure her safety, and she should go into her apartment, lock the door, and stay safe. Once Elena made it inside, she sat on her bed, and something compelled her to watch the footage one more time. That was when I heard the loudest scream I had ever heard in my life. I didn't wait for her to open the door. I just kicked it open and ran towards her bedroom with my gun pointed right ahead. Once I was in the bedroom, without thinking much, I just fired my gun. Bam! The echo of the shot reverberated throughout the room, and blood pooled against my foot. Mere moments ago, when Elena was rewatching the footage, she realized that she hadn't seen the footage to the very end. She had seen the man enter her apartment, but she never saw him leave. Just then, she felt someone breathe on her ankles, which were dangling from her bed. She immediately screamed when she realized that the intruder was still in her apartment. In fact, he was under her bed. That's when I showed up. The man had scrambled off the ground and was about to attack Elena when I shot him. He had a sharp kitchen knife and camera in his hand. I called in for backup, and the rest of the cops arrived soon. I was awarded for my bravery and promotion. I was happy that Elena was safe. However, I did some digging on the man and realized that he often broke into people's apartments and killed them. He was arrested for a break-in a couple of years ago, and he had also served some jail time. All in all, I was happy that no one would be harmed by this guy anymore. But it still knots my stomach thinking about the fact that Elena was never alone in her apartment. The man was coming and going in her apartment probably for a few days, and every night she slept on the bed, he was right there with a knife and his camera, ready to murder and record his next victim as they died.